Take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let me tell you a story.
The family courthouse in downtown Houston had seen thousands of people walk through its doors over the years. Some left smiling, some left angry. Others walked away carrying silence that words could never touch. On this warm Texas afternoon, people standing outside barely looked up when the courthouse doors opened again. Divorce hearings had become just another part of the building's daily rhythm until they saw her. Linda stepped through the glass doors with a single cardboard storage box resting carefully in her arms. It wasn't heavy. Inside were only a few framed photographs, a small desk plant, a leather notebook she had carried for years, and the coffee mug her students had once given her with the words, "Dream Bigger," painted across the side. That was all. No moving company waited nearby. No expensive attorney walked beside her. No luxury SUV pulled to the curb. No friends surrounded her. Just one woman, and one small box that seemed far too light to hold the weight of a marriage that had lasted years. The conversations outside the courthouse slowed. People noticed. A middle-aged couple waiting for another hearing glanced toward Linda before quietly exchanging looks. A young delivery driver stopped loading packages for a moment. Even the security officer near the entrance watched without saying anything. Finally, an elderly woman standing near the courthouse steps leaned closer to the man beside her and whispered softly enough that she thought no one else could hear. Poor woman. She must have lost everything. The words drifted through the afternoon air. Linda heard them. She didn't react. Her eyes remained fixed on the sidewalk ahead. Not because the comment didn't hurt, because she no longer had the strength to answer strangers who believed they understood someone else's story after watching only a few seconds of it. A few feet behind her, Richard stood near the courthouse entrance. His divorce papers were folded neatly inside a leather portfolio tucked beneath his arm. He watched Linda walk away without calling her name, without taking a single step after her. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't cold either. It was the quiet certainty of a man convinced that life had finally proved his point. For years he had warned Linda that kindness didn't build security, that spending every Saturday helping teenagers instead of attending networking events was keeping her from a better future. He had said it so many times that he had eventually started believing it as deeply as his own name. Now, as he watched his former wife carrying everything she had left inside one small box, he couldn't help thinking reality had finally caught up with her. This was what happened when people chose idealism over ambition. At least, that's what he believed. Linda reached the bottom of the courthouse steps. She paused for just a moment. Her shoulders rose with a slow breath before she wiped away the tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. No dramatic sobbing. No angry outburst. Just one quiet attempt to steady herself before facing whatever came next. She turned slightly toward the courthouse entrance. The receptionist who had checked everyone in that morning happened to be walking past the front lobby windows. The woman noticed Linda outside and offered a small, sympathetic wave. Most people in Linda's position would have looked away. Instead, Linda smiled. Not a forced smile. Not the kind people use to hide pain. A gentle, genuine smile, filled with the same warmth she had offered countless strangers throughout her life. She lifted one hand from beneath the box just long enough to wave back. "Thank you," she mouthed through the glass. The receptionist smiled in return. It lasted only a second. Then Linda adjusted the box in her arms and continued toward the sidewalk. Richard noticed the exchange. It confused him. She had just walked away from the end of her marriage. She had left without the house, without the expensive vehicle, without the investments they had built together, without the comfortable future he believed she had thrown away. So, why was she still finding a reason to make someone else's day a little brighter? Why wasn't she bitter? Why wasn't she blaming the world? Why did she still look like someone who believed tomorrow could hold something worth smiling about? Richard couldn't answer those questions. Neither could anyone else standing outside that courthouse, because none of them understood one simple truth. Sometimes the people who appear to have lost the most are carrying something no one else can see. Linda had barely taken a few more steps before the quiet outside the courthouse shifted. Not with shouting, not with sirens, with precision. The low hum of powerful engines rolled across the street. One by one, 3 polished black SUVs turned the corner and eased toward the curb directly in front of the courthouse. Every conversation stopped. Heads turned almost at the same time. The vehicles weren't flashy, but they carried the unmistakable presence of people accustomed to moving with purpose. Each one came to a smooth stop. The engines idled. For a brief moment, nobody got out. People began doing what people always do when something unexpected happens. They guessed. A man adjusting his tie glanced toward the courthouse entrance. Must be picking up one of those corporate executives. A woman waiting for a rideshare nodded. Probably somebody important. Even Richard looked toward the courthouse doors. His first thought was that another high-profile business figure must have finished a hearing. Houston wasn't short on wealthy people. He had attended enough investor meetings over the years to recognize the kind of transportation often arranged for executives. None of it seemed unusual until the doors opened. Several professionally dressed men and women stepped out. Their clothing was elegant, without trying too hard. Their movements were calm, disciplined. Nobody rushed. Nobody looked around in confusion. It was obvious they already knew exactly why they were there. One of the men glanced briefly toward the courthouse entrance. Another quietly scanned the sidewalk. A woman carrying a tablet exchanged a few words with someone beside her before pointing gently toward the far end of the walkway. Then something happened that made every assumption outside the courthouse collapse. Instead of walking toward the building, instead of waiting for some famous executive, instead of greeting anyone in expensive business attire, they walked straight past everyone else, past attorneys discussing their next cases, past sharply dressed businessmen, past families leaving the courthouse together. They ignored every person except one. Linda. She had almost reached the corner of the sidewalk when she noticed footsteps approaching. Thinking someone simply needed to pass, she shifted slightly to one side while carefully holding her storage box. The group stopped, a respectful distance away. No cameras. No dramatic introductions. The man standing at the front offered a polite smile before speaking. "Excuse me." Linda looked up. "Yes?" He asked only one question. "Is Linda still here?" For a second, nobody moved. The words seemed so unexpected that several people instinctively looked around, wondering if there was another Linda nearby. There wasn't. The question had been meant for only one person. Linda blinked in surprise. "I'm Linda." The group exchanged relieved looks. One woman quietly smiled, as though she'd been hoping they hadn't arrived too late. Behind them, the courthouse crowd watched in complete silence. The elderly woman who had whispered moments earlier slowly lowered her gaze from Linda's cardboard box to the line of waiting SUVs. The delivery driver forgot he was still holding a package. Even the security officer shifted his weight, trying not to stare while clearly doing exactly that. Richard frowned. His eyes moved from Linda to the people surrounding her, then back again. He searched every face. Nothing looked familiar. No investors, no clients. No business associates. He couldn't place a single person. Before anyone could ask another question, a cell phone rang. The sound cut cleanly through the stillness. The man nearest Linda answered immediately. His voice remained calm, professional. "Yes." He listened for several seconds. Then his expression softened. He gave a small nod before replying. "The aircraft is ready." Another brief pause. He looked toward Linda with quiet respect. "Tell Captain we're bringing Ms. Linda now." He ended the call. No further explanation. No announcement. No attempt to impress the crowd gathering around them. Richard felt his heartbeat quicken, without understanding why. Aircraft? Captain? Ms. Linda? Nothing about those words fit the woman he believed had just walked away with nothing. Linda herself looked equally confused. "I'm sorry," she said carefully. "I think there may be some mistake." The man shook his head almost immediately. "No, ma'am. There isn't." His answer raised more questions than it settled. Around them, whispers spread through the small crowd. "Did he say aircraft? Who is she? What's going on?" Richard took an unconscious step forward. For the first time since the divorce papers had been signed, he wasn't thinking about the marriage. He wasn't thinking about the settlement. He wasn't thinking about who had been right or wrong. He was thinking about one question that refused to leave his mind. Who had just come looking for Linda? And why? Miles away, beyond the courthouse and the growing curiosity it had stirred, the afternoon sun reflected brilliantly across the polished windows of a private jet waiting on the executive side of a Houston airport. Its engines rested in quiet readiness. The cabin door stood open. The flight crew waited patiently. Everything was prepared. Everything was on schedule. There was only one thing left before the aircraft could depart. Linda. But why a private jet had crossed the country for a woman who had just walked out of divorce court, carrying a single cardboard box? That answer would change far more than Richard ever imagined. Her ex believed she'd walked out of that courthouse with nothing. 30 minutes later, a private jet was waiting for only one passenger. Not a billionaire. Not a celebrity. Not a politician. A woman who had just left her marriage carrying a single cardboard box. Richard had spent years believing success belonged to the people with the right bank accounts, the right business cards, and the right invitations. What he didn't realize was that someone else had been keeping track of a very different kind of success. The kind that never appears on a balance sheet. The kind that can't be measured by property, investments, or luxury cars. And the kind that has a way of returning when it's needed most. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Have you ever been underestimated because people couldn't see what you were quietly building? Maybe someone looked at your job, your home, your bank account, or your circumstances, and decided they already knew your story. Maybe they mistook your kindness for weakness. Maybe they believed your willingness to help others meant you lacked ambition. Or perhaps you've watched someone give their time, their energy, and even their heart to people who could never repay them, only to hear others call it a waste. If you've ever lived through something like that, I'd love to hear your story. Share it in the comments below, because someone reading your words may need that encouragement today. Welcome back to Mr. George Stories, where life's most powerful lessons come wrapped in unforgettable tales. If you're new to this family, thank you for joining us. Please hit the subscribe button because it helps us share stories like this with more people on YouTube. And while you're here, take just a second to like this video. Every like, every comment, and every subscription tells YouTube that these stories matter, allowing them to reach someone who may need this message today. Now let me tell you something important before we continue. Today's story isn't really about a divorce. The divorce simply opened the first door. This story is about something much deeper. It's about the investments that almost nobody notices while they're being made. The quiet Saturdays, the encouraging conversations, the extra hours spent helping someone after everyone else has gone home, the phone call you answer when you're tired, the hand you extend without expecting applause, the words of hope you speak into someone who's almost ready to give up. Most people never receive recognition for those moments. Sometimes they don't even know whether they made a difference. Life moves on. Years pass. Faces change. The world keeps rushing forward, and it's easy to believe those small acts disappeared without leaving a mark. But every now and then, life has a remarkable way of revealing that kindness was never wasted, that compassion has a memory, that the people you lift today may one day be standing in places you never imagined. The question is, will they remember who believed in them when almost no one else did? Richard never imagined that question would one day confront him so personally. He believed he understood what success looked like. He believed he knew exactly how people built meaningful futures. By the end of this story, he would discover there was an entire kind of wealth he had spent years overlooking. And the lesson would come from the one person he thought had walked away with nothing. So don't go anywhere. Stay with me until the very end, because the real reason that private jet came looking for Linda doesn't just surprise Richard. It changes the way everyone standing outside that courthouse understands success, generosity, and the value of a life spent believing in other people. And when the truth is finally revealed, You'll understand why what looked like Linda's lowest day was actually the beginning of the greatest chapter of her life. Now, let's go back to where this story truly began. Long before the courthouse, long before the divorce, and long before anyone ever came searching for Linda with a private jet. The private jet waiting on the executive side of a Houston airport would have to wait a little longer. Its engines rested in silence beneath the Texas afternoon sun, while a flight crew stood ready for a passenger whose name had never appeared on the front page of a business magazine, never headlined a political fundraiser, and never sought attention for herself. Back at the courthouse, Richard remained frozen where Linda had left him. He couldn't understand why a woman he believed had just walked away with almost nothing had suddenly become the only person anyone inside those black SUVs seemed interested in finding. Linda herself looked just as surprised. Questions filled the air, but answers would have to wait. To understand why a private jet crossed the country looking for Linda. To understand why people who had never met Richard knew her name. To understand why one ordinary Saturday after another quietly shaped a future nobody could see. We have to go back. Not 1 week, not 1 year, 6 years earlier. Houston woke differently, depending on the neighborhood. In some parts of the city, mornings began with commuters hurrying toward downtown office towers, coffee in one hand and phones in the other. In Linda's neighborhood, the day started with familiar sounds that had nothing to do with boardrooms. A screen door opened somewhere down the block. A neighbor called good morning across a driveway. Someone laughed before 7 o'clock because another family had already started teasing each other over breakfast. The smell of smoked sausage drifted from one house, while another family prepared pancakes after an early church volunteer meeting. Children rode bicycles before the summer heat settled over the streets. Nobody stayed a stranger for very long. People checked on one another. If an elderly neighbor needed groceries, someone quietly took care of it. If a family welcomed a new baby, meals appeared at their front door before they even thought to ask for help. If somebody experienced loss, the neighborhood somehow knew exactly when to arrive, with food, folding chairs, warm embraces, and enough love to remind grieving families they weren't carrying the burden alone. That was the world that shaped Linda. She often said she learned long before adulthood that success wasn't measured by how many people recognized your name. It was measured by how many people felt seen because they had crossed your path. Her mother spent long shifts working as a registered nurse. Some evenings she returned home exhausted, her feet aching after hours spent caring for patients she would probably never see again. Yet no matter how tired she looked, she still found the energy to ask everyone at the dinner table the same question. What good happened for somebody else today? It wasn't a question about grades. It wasn't about promotions. It wasn't about money. She wanted each family member to remember that every day offered an opportunity to make another person's burden a little lighter. Sometimes Linda answered by talking about helping a classmate understand homework. Other days, she mentioned carrying groceries for an elderly neighbor. Her mother always smiled with quiet satisfaction. Never underestimate small kindnesses, she would say. Most people remember them longer than expensive gifts. Linda carried those words with her long after childhood. Her father influenced her differently. For nearly 30 years, he worked as an aircraft maintenance technician, a career he treated with deep respect. He believed every bolt tightened correctly, every inspection completed honestly, and every repair performed with care protected families who would never know his name. On Saturdays, when work allowed, he often took Linda to small regional airports around Houston. They weren't glamorous places. There were no crowds waiting for celebrity arrivals. No television cameras. Just rows of aircraft, mechanics focused on their work, pilots greeting one another, and the unmistakable scent of aviation fuel carried by the breeze. While other children might have become impatient, Linda loved every minute. She sat beside her father on folding chairs near the hangars, asking question after question. Why do the wings look different on that airplane? How does the engine keep running so smoothly? Why does that pilot inspect the aircraft before every flight? Her father never hurried his answers. Instead, he explained each detail carefully, occasionally sketching simple diagrams inside a notebook, so she could picture what happened beneath the polished exterior of every airplane. Then he would remind her of something she never forgot. "People usually notice the pilot," he said one Saturday while watching a training aircraft taxi toward the runway. "But every safe flight depends on dozens of people most passengers never meet." Linda looked toward the airplane climbing into the bright Texas sky. "So they're important, even if nobody knows who they are." Her father smiled. Especially then. Those conversations planted something inside her. She never dreamed of becoming the person in the cockpit. She became fascinated by something different. She wondered how many young people believed aviation wasn't meant for them, simply because nobody had ever shown them another possibility. The thought stayed with her through middle school. It followed her into high school, and it quietly became part of the woman she was growing into. Sunday brought another tradition. Church wasn't simply a place her family attended. It was where generations gathered, celebrated milestones, mourned together, welcomed newcomers, and reminded one another that faith meant little unless it appeared in everyday actions. After the service ended, nobody rushed home. Children raced across the fellowship hall, while grandparents caught up on family news. Someone always suggested taking another group photograph. Someone else always forgot where they had left their car keys. The laughter felt as familiar as the hymns they had sung only minutes earlier. From church, many families made their way to cookouts, where folding tables filled with homemade dishes stretched across backyards. Conversations moved easily from football rivalries to family memories, neighborhood news, recipes, and playful debates over whose barbecue deserved the highest praise. Linda loved those afternoons, not because everything was perfect, because everyone belonged. Even visitors who arrived, knowing nobody usually left carrying leftovers and invitations to come back the following weekend. That sense of community shaped every decision Linda would later make. She didn't believe people climbed higher by pushing others aside. She believed the strongest success created room for someone else to rise, too. Years later, when people asked why she gave so much of her time helping young people she had no obligation to mentor, her answer always came easily. Because somebody invested in me before they had any reason to. By the time she reached her early 30s, that belief guided almost everything she did. It was why, on nearly every Saturday morning, long before most of Houston had finished breakfast, Linda could be found volunteering with programs that introduced teenagers from underserved communities to careers in aviation. She never treated the students as charity cases. She treated them as future engineers, mechanics, pilots, educators, and leaders who simply needed someone willing to believe in them before they believed in themselves. One Saturday, that commitment led her to a charity fundraiser hosted at a local aerospace museum. The museum buzzed with activity from the moment its doors opened. Student volunteers hurried between exhibits. Families gathered around restored aircraft. Children climbed eagerly into flight simulators, while parents snapped photographs that would soon fill family albums. Linda moved confidently through the museum, greeting volunteers by name, checking schedules, answering questions, calming nervous teenagers before presentations, and thanking every staff member she passed. Her warmth seemed effortless. People who had met her only once often felt as though they had known her for years. She was reviewing a volunteer checklist near one of the museum's historic aircraft displays when she sensed someone watching her. She looked up. Across the exhibit hall stood a sharply dressed businessman attending the fundraiser with several investors. For just a brief moment, their eyes met. Neither of them realized it yet, but that single glance was about to change both of their lives. Richard wasn't the kind of man who usually stopped what he was doing because someone across a room caught his attention. His schedule rarely allowed for distractions. Every meeting had a purpose. Every introduction carried potential. Every event represented another opportunity to strengthen relationships that might open the next business door. That mindset hadn't appeared overnight. It had been shaping him since childhood. Richard grew up in an affluent suburb just outside Houston, where success was discussed as naturally as the weather. His parents loved him deeply. They expected excellence because they believed excellence created security. At the dinner table, conversations often revolved around growing businesses, market trends, expanding investments, and people whose influence reached far beyond Texas. When Richard earned good grades, his parents congratulated him. When he won academic awards, they celebrated. But what impressed them most was initiative. His father often reminded him, "Hard work gets you through the front door. Relationships decide how far you go after that." Richard listened carefully. Over the years, those words became part of the way he viewed the world. Weekends looked different in Richard's neighborhood than they did in Linda's. Instead of church picnics or neighborhood basketball games, many Saturdays included golf outings with business owners, charity dinners attended by executives, or social gatherings at country clubs where conversations moved effortlessly from family vacations to investment opportunities. Richard learned how to introduce himself confidently to adults before he was old enough to drive. He learned the importance of eye contact, a firm handshake, listening carefully before speaking, remembering names, building trust. His parents believed those habits would prepare him for the future. They were right. Richard was intelligent, disciplined, ambitious. By his late 30s, he had built a strong reputation as a businessman with remarkable focus. People respected his work ethic. Clients appreciated his reliability. Investors noticed that he approached every opportunity with careful preparation instead of reckless enthusiasm. He wasn't arrogant. He simply believed that every hour should move a person closer to success. That belief explained why he accepted an invitation to the Aerospace Museum fundraiser. Several potential investors planned to attend. Richard expected an enjoyable evening filled with meaningful conversations about aviation technology, regional business development, and future partnerships. He arrived, dressed in a tailored Navy suit that reflected the event's professional atmosphere without appearing overly formal. After greeting several familiar faces, he joined a small group discussing workforce shortages in the aerospace industry. The conversation flowed comfortably until something unexpected drew his attention away. Across the exhibit hall, a burst of laughter echoed near one of the restored aircraft displays. Richard glanced over. Linda stood surrounded by a group of teenage volunteers. One young volunteer looked overwhelmed while trying to organize registration materials that had accidentally slipped from a table onto the floor. Before anyone else could react, Linda knelt beside the student. "It's okay," she said with an encouraging smile. "We've all had mornings like this." The teenager laughed nervously. "I think I'm making a terrible first impression." Linda picked up several folders and handed them back. "I don't think anyone remembers perfection." She winked. "They remember kindness. So let's start there." The student's shoulders relaxed almost immediately. Within moments, the registration table was organized again. The conversation shifted from embarrassment to laughter. Richard noticed something unusual. Linda never made the teenager feel foolish. She protected the student's confidence while solving the problem. That impressed him far more than efficiency alone ever could. One of the investors speaking with Richard noticed his attention drifting. "You know her?" the man asked. Richard shook his head. "No, but I think I'd like to." A few minutes later, the museum's program director asked Linda to greet several guests arriving for the fundraiser. As she made her way through the exhibit hall, she welcomed visitors with genuine enthusiasm, thanking them for supporting programs that introduced young people to careers in aviation. When she reached Richard's group, the program director smiled. "Richard, I'd like you to meet Linda. She coordinates many of today's student volunteers." Linda extended her hand first. "It's nice to meet you." Richard returned the handshake. "The pleasure's mine. I've been watching how smoothly today's event is running." She laughed softly. "That's because you're seeing the polished version. If you'd arrived 2 hours earlier, you would have seen volunteers trying to decide whether balloons belong near historic aircraft." Richard chuckled. "I'm guessing that debate ended." It did. The airplanes won. They both laughed. The ease of the conversation surprised them. Neither felt the need to impress the other. Richard asked about the aviation education program. Instead of giving a rehearsed explanation, Linda spoke with genuine excitement. "We introduce students to careers they may never have considered before. Not everyone wants to become a pilot. Some discover engineering. Others become interested in maintenance, logistics, air traffic operations, or aviation management. I love watching young people realize there's more than one path into this industry." Richard listened carefully. "You really enjoy this?" "I do. Every student who walks through these doors deserves someone who believes in their potential." Before Richard could respond, two children sprinted across the exhibit hall, chasing each other with paper airplane gliders they had folded during one of the museum activities. One of the gliders floated directly between Linda and Richard before landing against Richard's shoe. Both children stopped instantly. Their eyes widened. "We're sorry," one of them blurted. "We weren't trying to hit anybody." Richard bent down, picked up the paper airplane, and examined it with exaggerated seriousness. "This is actually a pretty impressive design." The children exchanged uncertain glances. Linda folded her arms, smiling as she watched. Richard handed the paper airplane back. "But I think every aircraft deserves a proper test flight." He gently tossed it into the air. The glider floated several feet before circling gracefully toward the children. Both burst into laughter. "I told you it'd fly," one shouted. Linda laughed with them. "I think you've just earned yourself 2 new co-pilots." "They're definitely better pilots than I am," Richard admitted. The children thanked them before running back toward another activity. Linda looked at Richard. "I wasn't expecting that." "What? You?" He raised an eyebrow. "Is that good or bad?" "Good. You looked very serious from across the room." "I usually am." "I noticed." She smiled playfully. "But it's nice to know you can smile. And it's nice to know you can organize an entire fundraiser without looking stressed." "Oh, don't let appearances fool you. I've already solved 3 problems before lunch." Richard laughed. "I believe it." As the conversation continued, he found himself forgetting why he had attended the fundraiser in the first place. The investors could wait a few more minutes. For reasons he couldn't yet explain, he wanted to know more about the woman standing in front of him. She wasn't impressed by his tailored suit. She hadn't asked what kind of business he owned. She hadn't tried to discover who the influential people around him were. Instead, she seemed genuinely interested in people. Everyone. The volunteers, the museum staff, the children, the guests. She treated each conversation with the same warmth. That authenticity fascinated Richard. As the afternoon drew on, announcements signaled the beginning of the evening program. Guests slowly made their way toward the main auditorium. Richard hesitated for only a moment before speaking. "I know today's probably keeping you busy." Linda smiled. "That's an accurate observation. Would you be interested in having dinner with me sometime after all this settles down?" She studied him for a second. Not because she was impressed by his confidence, because she wanted to know whether he was sincere. Then she smiled. "I think I'd like that." For the first time all afternoon, Richard found himself looking forward to something that had nothing to do with business. Their first date began with a small misunderstanding that neither of them ever forgot. Richard had made a reservation at one of Houston's most elegant restaurants, believing it would make a good first impression. The dining room overlooked the city skyline. Soft piano music floated through the air, and every table was dressed with crisp white linens. When Linda arrived, she paused just inside the entrance and smiled. "So, this is how businessmen eat?" Richard laughed. "Too much?" She looked around with playful curiosity. "I've never had a waiter pull out my chair before. Should I apologize?" "Not yet." They both laughed as they took their seats. The evening never marriage suited Linda and Richard better than either of them expected. The first apartment they shared wasn't extravagant, but it felt like home almost immediately because they filled it with laughter instead of expensive decorations. On their first evening after returning from their honeymoon, they stood in the kitchen, staring at a collection of unopened wedding gifts. Richard held up a brand new cookware set. "So," he said with a grin, Which one of us actually knows how to use these? Linda folded her arms. I hope that's a joke. It depends. On what? Whether you're volunteering to cook. She laughed. I'll cook. Richard smiled with relief. I was hoping you'd say that. She reached into a cabinet and handed him an apron. Oh no. Oh yes. I thought I was getting promoted to taste tester. You've been promoted to chopping vegetables. Richard looked down at the apron. I suddenly missed takeout. Within minutes, the kitchen filled with conversation, playful teasing, and the sound of music drifting softly from a speaker on the counter. Richard insisted he could follow any recipe. Linda discovered he measured ingredients with remarkable precision, but somehow managed to leave flour on nearly every surface. She shook her head, laughing as she wiped the counter. You know? What? I've never seen anyone make such an organized mess. I prefer the term creative process. The kitchen disagrees. They laughed until tears filled their eyes. Those evenings became one of their favorite traditions. Some nights they experimented with recipes they found online. Other nights they argued, good-naturedly, about whose barbecue sauce deserved to accompany dinner. Richard remained convinced that his favorite recipe was unbeatable. Linda refused to surrender. You only think yours is better because it's familiar. No, I think it's better because it is better. She raised an eyebrow. We'll let my family decide. Richard smiled nervously. I suddenly don't trust this competition. Smart man. When dinner was finished, they often left the dishes in the sink for a little while longer than they should have. Not because they were avoiding chores, because they enjoyed sitting together at the table long after the meal had ended, talking about everything from childhood memories to dreams they hoped to build together. Neither imagined those conversations would one day become something they desperately missed. Another tradition soon found its place in their marriage. Whenever Richard finished work early enough, they climbed into the car with no destination in mind. Houston's highways stretched ahead, while the city's evening lights reflected against the windshield. Sometimes they drove through neighborhoods neither had visited before. Sometimes they stopped for coffee. Sometimes they simply rolled the windows down and let the warm Texas air accompany quiet conversations. Those drives became a place where neither felt rushed. Business stayed at the office. Volunteer schedules stayed on the calendar. For an hour or two they were simply Linda and Richard. On several evenings, they found themselves near the observation areas around Hobby Airport. They bought milkshakes from a nearby shop, leaned against the car, and watched airplanes descend through the evening sky. Every arrival fascinated Linda just as much as it had when she was a little girl sitting beside her father at regional airports. Richard noticed the excitement in her eyes. You never get tired of watching airplanes. I don't think I ever will. What are you thinking about? She smiled, without taking her eyes off the aircraft, lining up for landing. I'm thinking every airplane carries somebody's story. Richard looked toward the runway. A business trip. A family reunion. A military homecoming. A student leaving home for college. She nodded. Exactly. I wonder how many lives change every time one of those doors opens. Richard slipped his hand into hers. I've never thought about it that way. You will now. He laughed. I probably will. Saturday mornings became another rhythm in their life together. Richard often slept a little later after demanding work weeks. Linda usually woke before sunrise. She prepared coffee, packed a small bag with lesson materials, notebooks, and volunteer schedules, then quietly kissed Richard goodbye before leaving for the nonprofit aviation education program. One Saturday, Richard opened one eye as she reached for her keys. Already leaving? She smiled. The students are expecting me. What time will you be home? This afternoon. You do realize most people sleep in on Saturdays. I know. And you're giving up your weekend. I'm spending it exactly where I want to be. He smiled. Drive safely. I always do. At first, Richard admired her commitment. Whenever she returned home, she talked excitedly about teenagers discovering careers in aviation, scholarship opportunities, and students who had begun believing in themselves. Her enthusiasm was contagious. Richard genuinely enjoyed listening. He didn't fully understand her passion, but he respected it. Months passed. Richard's own career continued gaining momentum. One successful project led to another. Existing clients referred new business. His calendar filled faster than ever before. Meetings that had once been monthly became weekly, then almost daily. He accepted invitations to executive breakfasts before work. Networking luncheons occupied afternoons. Evenings increasingly belonged to business dinners, where future partnerships often began over shared meals rather than conference tables. Richard never complained. He viewed every invitation as another opportunity to build a stronger future for them both. Soon, weekends began changing too. Golf outings with clients appeared on his calendar. Leadership retreats, investment receptions, private networking events, where influential business leaders gathered outside office walls. He attended because he believed relationships created opportunities that hard work alone could not. One Saturday afternoon, Linda returned home carrying folders from the aviation program. Richard had just finished changing clothes after spending the morning at a golf event hosted for several business leaders. "How was your day?" Linda asked. "Productive. I met 2 potential clients." "That's wonderful. How about yours?" She smiled. "One of our students said today was the first time he believed college might actually be possible." Richard smiled politely. "That's nice." Linda noticed the briefness of his response but thought little of it. Both of them were simply tired. Weeks became months. The differences in their Saturdays slowly became more noticeable. Richard spent more time with executives, investors, and entrepreneurs. Linda spent more time mentoring young people who were still searching for direction. Neither believed the other was doing anything wrong. They simply couldn't see the world through the same lens anymore. One evening, Richard glanced at the calendar hanging in the kitchen. He counted quietly. "You volunteered every Saturday this month." Linda looked up from preparing dinner. "I have. And next Saturday too. That's our scholarship workshop." He nodded thoughtfully. "You really never miss." "I try not to." He leaned against the kitchen counter. "I've been wondering something." She turned toward him. "What is it?" Richard hesitated. His question wasn't meant to criticize. It came from genuine curiosity. "Have you ever thought about taking one Saturday off?" Linda smiled gently. "For what?" "So we could spend the whole day together." Her expression softened. "I'd like that." "Then why not?" She looked at the calendar again before meeting his eyes. "Because those students are counting on me." Richard nodded, though he wasn't entirely satisfied with the answer. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply wondered for the first time whether there would always be room in their marriage for both his growing ambitions and Linda's unwavering commitment to the young people who waited for her every Saturday. Neither of them realized that quiet question had just become the first small crack in a marriage that still held so much love. The first disagreement didn't begin with raised voices. It began with a calendar. Linda stood in the kitchen one Thursday evening writing reminders on the family calendar hanging beside the refrigerator. Saturday, aviation mentoring session, scholarship workshop, parent information meeting. Richard walked in carrying his laptop bag and loosened his tie before pouring himself a glass of water. He glanced at the calendar. "You've got another full Saturday." Linda smiled. "We've been preparing for this workshop for weeks." Richard nodded. "I remember." She walked over and kissed him on the cheek. "How was your meeting?" "Long, but productive." "I'm glad." She reached for 2 dinner plates. "I made your favorite." Richard smiled. "See? This is why I married you." Linda laughed. "No, you married me because I beat you at miniature golf on our 3rd date. I've tried very hard to forget that. You still lost." "I had a bad putter." "You had bad aim." They both laughed. For a while, evenings like this still felt easy. Dinner became the part of the day where work disappeared. Richard talked about new business opportunities. Linda shared stories about students discovering careers they had never imagined. They listened. They encouraged one another. Neither realized that they were slowly beginning to speak different languages. One spoke more and more about growth. The other spoke more and more about purpose. Neither was wrong. They simply valued different rewards. A few weeks later, Richard attended another investor dinner. It was held at one of Houston's private clubs, where conversations flowed as smoothly as the expensive coffee served afterward. One investor leaned back in his chair. "So, Richard, what does your wife do?" Richard smiled. "Linda works with aviation education." The investor nodded politely. "Interesting." Richard continued without thinking. "She volunteers with students every Saturday." The investor smiled. "That's nice." The conversation immediately shifted back toward business. Richard didn't notice anything unusual. To him, he had simply answered the question. He never considered how much more there was to Linda's work than one simple sentence. That same Saturday, Linda spent nearly 8 hours helping teenagers prepare scholarship applications. Some had never spoken in front of a group before. Others doubted they belonged anywhere near the aviation industry. She encouraged each one patiently. When one student became frustrated after struggling through a mock interview, Linda sat beside the teenager instead of correcting from across the room. "Let's try again. I keep saying the wrong thing." "No, you're worrying about saying the perfect thing. Those are different problems." The teenager looked discouraged. "What if nobody chooses me?" Linda smiled warmly. "Then we learn, we improve, and we keep going." She paused before adding softly, "One opportunity doesn't decide your future." The student took a deep breath. "Can we practice one more time?" Linda nodded. "As many times as you need." She stayed nearly an hour after everyone else had left. She never mentioned it to Richard. She simply came home tired, satisfied, and grateful. As autumn arrived, Richard's calendar continued filling. Investor breakfasts, client dinners, leadership forums, golf invitations. Every successful meeting seemed to create 3 more. He appreciated the momentum. He believed he was building something that would secure their future for decades. One evening, he spread several invitations across the dining table. Linda glanced over. "Busy month?" "You could say that." He smiled. "I've been invited to 3 networking weekends." "Congratulations. They're important." "I know." He looked at her. "I'd like you to come with me." Linda's face brightened. "I'd love to." Richard hesitated. "They're all on Saturdays." Linda's smile faded slightly. "Oh, you already have the program." "I do." He nodded. "I figured." Silence settled between them for a moment. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Richard finally spoke. "You've never missed one." "I made a commitment." "I know." He tapped one invitation gently. "I just wonder sometimes." She looked at him. "What?" "If you're giving more of yourself to those students, then you leave for yourself." Linda answered quietly. "I don't feel empty after being with them. I feel useful." Richard wasn't trying to criticize. He genuinely didn't understand. "I guess I don't see why it has to be every Saturday." Linda folded the invitations neatly into a stack before handing them back. "Because consistency matters. They trust me to be there. I'm one of the adults in their lives who keeps showing up." Richard looked thoughtful. "I understand loyalty, but you're giving away an entire day every week." Linda met his eyes. "They're not taking something from me. I'm choosing to give it." A few days later, they attended another community fundraiser. Richard introduced Linda to several business associates. The conversations were pleasant, professional, respectful. One guest smiled at Richard. "So tell me about your wife." Richard answered naturally. "My wife volunteers." The words left his mouth without hesitation. Linda smiled politely. She continued the conversation. Nobody else noticed anything unusual. Richard certainly didn't. But something inside Linda became unexpectedly quiet. Not because the statement was false. She did volunteer. But that wasn't the whole truth. She didn't simply spend Saturdays helping. She built programs. She mentored students. She organized scholarships. She encouraged families. She opened doors for young people who had never imagined a future in aviation. Those few words, "My wife volunteers," reduced years of purpose into something that sounded like a casual weekend hobby. She didn't interrupt him. She didn't correct him. She continued smiling. She asked thoughtful questions. She laughed when everyone else laughed. Only Richard noticed, much later that evening, that she had become unusually quiet during the drive home. "You okay?" She nodded. "I'm just tired." He accepted the answer. She looked out the passenger window at the passing lights. She wasn't angry. She wasn't offended. She was simply wondering whether the man she loved truly understood why those Saturdays mattered so much to her. At the same time, Richard wondered whether Linda understood how much pressure he felt to keep building opportunities for the future. Neither questioned the other's character. Neither doubted the other's love. They simply kept seeing the same marriage from two different perspectives. And without realizing it, those perspectives were drifting a little farther apart with every passing week. Winter arrived with a full calendar and even fuller expectations. Richard's business had reached a point he had worked toward for years. Projects that once seemed out of reach were now becoming reality. Companies that had overlooked him before were returning his calls. His reputation continued growing, and with every successful partnership came another introduction, another invitation, and another opportunity to move forward. One Monday morning, Richard arrived home earlier than usual. Linda was sitting at the dining table reviewing lesson plans for the upcoming Saturday aviation program. Several folders were spread neatly across the table, along with scholarship information, workshop schedules, and handwritten notes she planned to use during mentoring sessions. Richard placed his briefcase beside the chair and smiled. "I've got some good news." Linda looked up immediately. "You do? I think this could be the biggest opportunity of my career." Her face lit up. "Richard, that's wonderful." He sat beside her. "I've been invited to join a partnership with several investors I've been meeting over the past year." Linda reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I know how hard you've worked for this." "I really do." He smiled. "If everything goes well, it changes everything." She laughed softly. "I think we should celebrate." "I was hoping you'd say that." That evening they shared dinner at their favorite neighborhood restaurant, laughing about old memories and talking about the future. For a few hours it felt like the early years of their marriage again. The conversation flowed easily. Richard spoke about expanding his business. Linda spoke about students preparing for scholarship interviews. Both listened with genuine interest. As they drove home beneath the glow of Houston's city lights, Richard glanced toward her. "I've missed evenings like this. So have I." He reached over and held her hand. "We've both been busy." Linda nodded. "But busy doesn't have to mean distant." He smiled. "No, it doesn't." For a moment, it seemed as though the growing distance between them might finally begin to close. Neither realized how quickly that hope would be tested. A week later, Richard attended a private dinner with the investor group. The discussion lasted nearly 4 hours. When it finally ended, one of the senior investors leaned forward. "We're impressed with your vision." Richard thanked him. "But this partnership requires more than good ideas." Richard listened carefully. "We expect commitment. You'll be representing all of us. There will be weekend retreats, client entertainment, executive golf events, industry conferences. We build relationships outside the office just as much as inside it." Richard nodded. "I understand. We also encourage spouses to participate whenever possible. They become part of the relationships we're building." Richard immediately thought of Linda. He imagined introducing her to future clients. He pictured them attending events together, supporting one another as they had promised on their wedding day. The idea filled him with optimism. Driving home that night, he rehearsed how he wanted to tell her. He wasn't worried. He believed she would understand how important this opportunity could become. The following Saturday morning, Linda was preparing to leave for the aviation program when Richard stopped her near the front door. "Do you have a minute?" "Of course." She set her bag down. Richard smiled. "I've been thinking about the partnership." "So have I." "I'm proud of you." He hesitated. "They've asked spouses to become more involved." Linda nodded. "That makes sense. There will be weekend events almost every month." She listened quietly. "Most of them are on Saturdays." Linda looked at him without speaking. "I'd really like us to attend together." "I'd like that too." He smiled with relief. "But—" She lowered her eyes briefly before looking back at him. "The aviation program meets every Saturday." "I know. I've already committed to this year's students." Richard folded his arms thoughtfully. "What if someone else covered for you?" Linda smiled gently. "They already have responsibilities of their own. I'm not the only volunteer, but I'm one of the people those students expect to see every week." He nodded. "I understand." She could tell he was choosing his words carefully. "So, what are you asking me?" Richard took a slow breath. "I'm asking if you could step back from the program." She stared at him, uncertain she had heard correctly. "Temporarily?" He hesitated. "I was actually thinking permanently." Silence settled between them. Not angry, not dramatic, just heavy. Linda searched his face. "You want me to stop?" "I think we're entering a different season of life. This partnership could shape our future. We'll have opportunities we've never imagined. We'll meet people who can open incredible doors." Linda answered softly. "Richard, my Saturdays aren't standing in the way of your success." "I don't see it that way." She paused. "I've spent years building relationships with those students. I promised I'd keep showing up. And you have. You've done an amazing job. But maybe you've accomplished what you set out to do." Linda slowly shook her head. "No, I haven't. There are new students every year. Every year, another group walks through those doors wondering if they belong." He sighed. "I just don't understand why it has to be you." She looked at him with sadness rather than frustration. "Because someone stayed for me. When I was growing up, people invested their time in my future. My parents, my teachers, my church family, my neighbors. They kept showing up. I'm simply doing the same for someone else." Richard leaned against the kitchen counter. "I want us building our future together." Linda stepped closer. "I thought we already were, just in different ways." He looked away. "Sometimes it feels like you're choosing those students over us." The words lingered between them. Linda's expression changed, not with anger, with hurt. "I'm not choosing them instead of you. I'm choosing to remain the person you fell in love with." Richard immediately regretted how his words sounded. "That's not what I meant." "I know, but that's how it feels." He reached for her hand. "I love you." "I know you do." "I love you too." "That's why this is so hard." Neither raised their voice. Neither accused the other of selfishness. Richard wasn't trying to control Linda. He genuinely believed sacrificing one commitment would create greater opportunities for their future together. Linda wasn't rejecting Richard's dreams. She simply couldn't abandon the work that had become part of who she was. Neither person wanted to win an argument. Both wanted to protect the marriage. Yet both were asking the other to surrender something deeply important. Richard wanted Linda beside him as he entered the biggest chapter of his career. Linda wanted Richard to understand that her purpose wasn't a hobby she could set aside whenever life became busy. They stood only a few feet apart, closer than ever physically, farther apart in understanding than they had ever been. Finally, Linda picked up her volunteer bag. "I have to go." Richard nodded slowly. I know. She walked to the front door. Before leaving, she turned back. I hope one day you'll see what I see when I look at those students. Richard offered a faint smile. And I hope one day you'll see what I see when I look at our future. She nodded gently. I hope so too. The front door closed softly behind her. Richard remained standing in the quiet kitchen long after her car had disappeared from the driveway. Hours later, Linda stood inside the aviation classroom encouraging another group of teenagers to believe in possibilities they had never considered before. She smiled. She listened. She encouraged. Yet, part of her heart remained at home. That evening when she returned, the house was peaceful. Dinner sat untouched in the refrigerator. Richard was reading in the living room. Linda sat beside him. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't hostile. It was unfamiliar. Once, laughter had filled every corner of their home. Now silence had quietly taken its place. Neither of them knew it yet. But that silence would become the hardest conversation of all. Silence has a way of settling into a home without asking permission. It doesn't arrive all at once. It slips into ordinary moments. The drive to work becomes quieter. Dinner conversations become shorter. Questions that once led to laughter begin ending with simple answers. Linda and Richard still loved each other. Neither doubted that. What frightened them was something far more difficult to name. They no longer felt understood. One evening, Richard arrived home carrying takeout instead of stopping at the grocery store as he usually did. I figured neither of us would feel like cooking tonight, he said. Linda smiled appreciatively. That sounds perfect. They set the containers on the dining table and ate together. The television remained off. Music didn't play in the background. Only the occasional sound of silverware broke the quiet. Richard looked up. How was your Saturday program? It went well. We finished scholarship interviews. He nodded. That's good. How was your golf event? It was productive. Another pause. Years earlier, one simple answer would have sparked another question. Now both of them searched for something meaningful to say, only to discover the conversation slipping away before it had the chance to grow. Linda finally smiled gently. I miss hearing your stories. Richard looked surprised. I still tell you about work. You tell me what happened. She lowered her eyes briefly. You used to tell me how you felt about it. Richard sat quietly. She was right. Without realizing it, he had begun describing accomplishments instead of experiences, numbers instead of emotions, meetings instead of memories. He reached across the table. I've been tired. I know. So have I. Neither blamed the other. Both recognized the exhaustion. Neither understood its source. A few weeks later, Linda suggested something neither of them had mentioned before. What would you think about talking with a marriage counselor? Richard didn't answer immediately. Not because he rejected the idea, because saying yes meant admitting they needed help. Finally, he nodded. I'll go. The first session felt awkward, not hostile, just unfamiliar. Linda spoke honestly about missing the partnership they once shared. Richard admitted he felt increasing pressure to provide opportunities that could secure their future. When asked what first brought them together, both answered almost at the same time. We admired each other's dreams. The room became quiet. Linda smiled sadly. I don't know when we stopped protecting those dreams. Richard looked toward her. Neither did he. They attended another session, then another. Sometimes they left feeling hopeful. Other times they drove home in thoughtful silence. Neither of them walked away believing the other was selfish. That was the difficult part. There wasn't a villain sitting on either side of the room. There were simply two good people struggling to recognize the value of dreams that looked different from their own. One Saturday afternoon, after another counseling session, Linda looked out the passenger window as Richard drove. Would you mind taking a small detour? Where? Hobby Airport. He glanced at her and smiled faintly. It's been a while. It has. Without another word, he changed directions. They parked near the familiar observation area where they had spent so many evenings during the early years of their marriage. The sky glowed with warm shades of orange as aircraft lined up for landing. For several minutes they stood side by side, watching one airplane descend after another. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "Remember our milkshakes?" Linda laughed. Softly. "You always finished yours before I was halfway done." "I still do." "I know." He smiled. "You used to make up stories about the passengers. I still wonder about them." She watched another aircraft touch down. "I wonder who's coming home. Who's starting over? Who's chasing a dream?" Richard looked at her. "You haven't changed." She answered quietly. "I don't think that's the problem." He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" She took a slow breath. "I keep wondering when we stopped being teammates." The question settled between them. Richard searched for an answer. He couldn't find one. "I never stopped being on your side." "I know. I thought I was protecting us." Linda turned toward him. "I believe you. I've never doubted your intentions." He looked relieved for a moment. Then she continued. "But somewhere along the way, we started protecting different futures." Richard leaned against the fence, overlooking the runway. "I've been trying to build a life where you never have to worry." Linda stepped beside him. "And I've been trying to build a life where other families have reasons to hope." He looked down. "I thought those goals could eventually meet." "So did I." Another aircraft climbed into the evening sky. They watched until its lights disappeared. Driving home, neither realized how much they were grieving. Not the marriage. Not yet. They were grieving the effortless friendship that had once made every ordinary day feel extraordinary. Richard still believed he could save their future if he worked a little harder and opened a few more doors. Linda still believed they could find each other again if they remembered why they had first fallen in love. Neither recognized the painful truth waiting quietly ahead. Love had never completely left their marriage, but respect for each other's calling had slowly faded. And without that respect, even the deepest love was beginning to lose its footing. The decision didn't happen after one dramatic argument. It arrived quietly. Weeks passed after their visit to Hobby Airport. Linda and Richard continued attending counseling. They continued eating dinner together when their schedules allowed. They continued asking about each other's day. From the outside, nothing looked broken. Inside their home, however, they both sensed they were trying to preserve something that no longer knew how to breathe. One evening, Richard closed the folder containing notes from another investor meeting and looked across the living room. Linda was reviewing materials for the next Saturday's aviation workshop. The familiar sight brought an unexpected sadness, not because she was doing anything wrong, because he already knew what the weekend would look like before either of them spoke. He cleared his throat. "Can we talk?" Linda gently closed her notebook. "Of course." He took a long breath before saying the words that had weighed on him for weeks. "I don't think we're making each other happy anymore." Linda didn't answer immediately. She simply looked at him. There was no anger in her eyes, only heartbreak. "I've been asking myself the same question," she admitted quietly. Richard lowered his head. "I kept believing we'd eventually meet in the middle." "So did I." "I don't know how to ask you to become someone you're not." Linda felt tears gathering, but she didn't look away. "And I don't know how to stop being the person I've spent my whole life becoming." Silence settled over the room. Neither reached for an argument. Neither searched for someone to blame. Richard spoke again. "I still love you." Linda nodded slowly. "I know. I still love you too." The words made everything harder instead of easier. If love had disappeared, the decision might have felt simple, but love remained. What had faded was their ability to honor the dreams that defined one another. Richard rubbed his hands together. "I've been thinking." Linda waited. "Maybe the kindest thing we can do," he struggled to finish, "is let each other go." The sentence hung in the air. Linda closed her eyes for a moment. She had feared hearing those words. Now that they had finally been spoken, she realized she had also been carrying them in her own heart. When she opened her eyes again, tears rolled quietly down her cheeks. "I never imagined our story ending this way." Richard's voice was barely above a whisper. "Neither did I." For a long time, they simply sat together, not as opponents, not as strangers, as two people mourning a future they had sincerely hoped to share. Over the following days, they began discussing practical matters. Every conversation felt heavier than the last. The house, their belongings, financial arrangements. Neither tried to punish the other. Neither argued over possessions. More than once, Richard suggested Linda keep things she insisted should remain with him. More than once, Linda encouraged Richard to choose whatever would help him move forward. Their conversations remained respectful, even when they were painful. One Saturday morning, Linda began packing her personal belongings. She worked slowly, not because she owned very much, because every object carried a memory. She folded a sweater Richard had once wrapped around her shoulders during an evening at the airport when the breeze had turned unexpectedly cool. She smiled through tears before placing it carefully inside a box. A framed photograph from one of their early church picnics rested on the bookshelf. Richard stood nearby while she lifted it gently. "We laughed all afternoon that day," he said quietly. Linda nodded. "You kept insisting you could beat everyone at the sack race. I was overconfident." "You were." A small laugh escaped both of them. For just a second, the years between then and now disappeared. Then reality returned. Linda wrapped the photograph in protective paper. Neither spoke again for several minutes. Her parents welcomed her with open arms when she told them the marriage was ending. They didn't criticize Richard. They didn't encourage bitterness. Instead, they reminded her that grief deserved honesty. Her mother held her close. "You don't have to pretend you're strong every minute." Linda finally allowed herself to cry. Not because she regretted loving Richard, because she had imagined growing old beside him. Her father listened quietly before speaking. "Sometimes two good people still reach different roads." Linda wiped away her tears. "I wanted us to find the same road." "I know." He placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "And I'm proud that you never stopped treating him with respect." The church family that had watched Linda grow up surrounded her with the same quiet support she had spent years offering others. Meals appeared without anyone making a grand announcement. Cards arrived with handwritten messages of encouragement. After one Sunday service, several older members embraced her without asking unnecessary questions. They understood that some pain didn't need advice. It simply needed company. Linda appreciated every gesture, yet she still carried much of her grief privately. Late at night, after everyone else had gone to bed, she sometimes sat alone by the window. She cried softly. She prayed. She remembered their first date, their kitchen dances, their drives through Houston, the evenings watching airplanes together. She never wished Richard failure. She never replayed old arguments, searching for reasons to hate him. Instead, she quietly thanked God for the beautiful years they had shared, even while grieving the years they would never have. Across town, Richard immersed himself in work. He convinced himself that staying busy would make everything easier. Whenever friends asked how he was doing, he answered with polite optimism, "I'll be okay." Deep down, he still believed something else. He believed that after enough time had passed, Linda would eventually realize he had only wanted to protect their future. Perhaps then, he thought, she would understand why he had asked her to step away from the aviation program. Perhaps she would even admit he had been right. It wasn't arrogance. It was the sincere belief that practical decisions eventually made more sense than emotional ones. He didn't realize that Linda had never rejected practicality. She had simply refused to abandon the purpose that gave her life meaning. Days later, Linda returned to the nonprofit aviation program. The students greeted her with the same excitement they always had. She smiled warmly. She encouraged them. She celebrated their progress. One student noticed she seemed quieter than usual. "Are you okay?" Linda smiled gently. "I've had a difficult week." The student looked concerned. "I'm sorry." She placed a reassuring hand on the student's shoulder. "Thank you. But today isn't about me. It's about your future." Then she continued helping with scholarship essays, as though nothing had happened. Not because her heart wasn't hurting, because she believed the young people in front of her deserved her full attention. Even in the middle of heartbreak, Linda refused to let pain become an excuse to stop showing up for others. She left that afternoon emotionally exhausted, yet grateful that serving someone else had reminded her she still had something meaningful to give. Neither she nor Richard realized how close they now stood to the day that would formally end their marriage. The signatures had not yet been written. The courthouse doors had not yet opened. But both of them could already feel the weight of goodbye, drawing closer with every passing sunrise. The morning of the divorce arrived with clear skies over Houston. Linda woke before sunrise, just as she had on countless Saturdays when she volunteered with the aviation program. For a few quiet moments, she sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the stillness around her. Today felt different. Not because she had stopped loving Richard, but because she had accepted that love alone could no longer carry a marriage where two people no longer understood the dreams that shaped each other. She stood, got dressed carefully, and paused before leaving. Her eyes settled on a framed photograph resting on the dresser. It had been taken years earlier, near Hobby Airport. She and Richard were laughing at something neither of them would probably remember now. She picked up the frame, smiled sadly, then placed it gently into a small cardboard storage box beside a leather notebook, a small desk plant, and the coffee mug her students had once given her. She closed the box. There would be no moving truck, no long list of possessions, just a few personal belongings that mattered to her. Across town, Richard adjusted his tie in the mirror before leaving for the courthouse. He looked composed, professional, the same image he presented in boardrooms and investor meetings. Yet beneath that calm exterior lived a heaviness he hadn't expected. He had imagined that reaching this day would finally bring clarity. Instead, it brought questions he still couldn't answer. Could they have tried harder? Had he listened enough? Had she? He took a slow breath, picked up the folder containing the final paperwork, and walked out the door. The courthouse moved with its usual rhythm. Attorneys greeted clients. Families waited quietly in hallways. Court employees guided people from one office to another. For everyone else, it was another ordinary workday. For Linda and Richard, it marked the closing of a chapter neither had ever wanted to end. When their names were called, they entered together. Neither rushed, neither spoke. The proceedings were respectful and brief. There were no dramatic accusations, no shouting, no attempts to embarrass one another. Questions were asked. Documents were reviewed. Signatures were placed where required. Every pen stroke seemed far louder than it should have. Linda looked at the final page for a moment before signing her name. As she handed the document back, she quietly whispered to herself, "I truly wanted this to work." Richard heard her. His chest tightened. So did I. Those 4 words carried years of memories. First dates, kitchen dancing, family dinners, long drives through Houston, watching airplanes together. The conversations that had once made everything else feel possible. Now they belonged to the past. The hearing concluded. The judge offered a few respectful closing remarks before the session ended. Linda and Richard stood. For a brief second, they faced one another. Neither knew whether to hug, whether to shake hands, whether to simply walk away. Finally, Richard spoke. "I never wanted to become someone who made you feel unseen." Linda looked into his eyes. "And I never wanted you to think I didn't believe in your dreams." A faint, bittersweet smile appeared on his face. "I always believed in you. I just thought success looked different." Linda nodded gently. "I know." She adjusted the cardboard box in her arms. "I hope your business becomes everything you've worked for," Richard answered honestly. "And I hope you never lose the part of you that kept believing in people." For a moment, it felt as though they might say something more. Instead, they accepted what could no longer be changed. Linda turned and walked toward the courthouse exit. Richard remained standing where he was. He watched her disappear through the doorway, carrying only the small storage box. People outside noticed her immediately. A young man waiting near the entrance glanced at the box before quietly looking away. Two women paused in the middle of their conversation. An elderly couple, standing near the courthouse steps, exchanged sympathetic expressions. One woman leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Poor woman. She must have lost everything." Linda heard the words. She didn't respond. She understood how easily appearances shaped assumptions. If someone had judged only that single moment, they would have seen a woman leaving a marriage with almost nothing in her hands. They could not possibly see everything she carried inside her heart. She continued walking. Halfway down the steps, she paused. Through the courthouse windows, she noticed the receptionist who had greeted everyone that morning. The woman offered Linda a small, encouraging wave. Linda's eyes glistened with tears. Even so, she smiled warmly and waved back. "Thank you," she mouthed. The receptionist smiled in return. Richard witnessed the exchange from inside the building. He couldn't understand it. How could someone facing this much heartbreak still think about making another person smile? He remained by the entrance, watching Linda move toward the sidewalk. He believed life had finally taught her the lesson he had tried to explain for years. Kindness was admirable. Compassion was meaningful. But surely this day proved that good intentions alone couldn't build security. Or so he believed. Linda stepped onto the sidewalk. She tightened her grip on the cardboard box and prepared to keep walking. Before she could take another step, the quiet hum of approaching engines drew everyone's attention. 3 polished black SUVs rolled slowly toward the curb in front of the courthouse. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. People instinctively assumed someone important was arriving. Perhaps a prominent executive. Perhaps a public official. The vehicles came to a smooth stop. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Then the doors opened. Several professionally dressed men and women stepped onto the sidewalk. Their movements were calm, purposeful. They looked past the attorneys, past the waiting families, past the business people entering the courthouse. None of those people seemed to be the reason they had come. Richard frowned. He searched their faces. He didn't recognize any of them. Linda shifted slightly, assuming they needed to pass. Instead, the group walked directly toward her. The man at the front stopped a respectful distance away. He offered a polite smile before asking a single question. "Is Linda still here?" The courthouse entrance fell completely silent. Richard stared in disbelief. The elderly woman who had pitied Linda only moments earlier looked from the cardboard box to the waiting SUVs, trying to understand what she was seeing. Linda blinked, surprised. "I'm Linda." The group exchanged relieved smiles. They had found exactly the person they were looking for. Richard took one slow step forward. His certainty about everything he thought he understood began to crack. Why would people arriving in vehicles like these be searching for Linda? And how did they know her? Before anyone could speak again, a phone rang. The man nearest Linda answered. He listened quietly for a few seconds before replying in a calm voice. "The aircraft is ready." He glanced respectfully toward Linda. "Tell Captain, we're bringing Miss Linda now." Richard's eyes widened. Aircraft? Captain? Nothing about those words made sense. Miles away, at a Houston executive airport, a beautifully maintained private jet waited with its cabin door open. Its destination was already filed. Its crew was prepared. Everything was ready to depart. Everything. Except the arrival of the woman they had flown to Texas to find. The man standing before Linda lowered his phone and slipped it back into his jacket. The respectful smile on his face never changed. "Ms. Linda," he said gently, "thank you for waiting." Linda shifted the cardboard box slightly in her arms. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There hasn't." His answer came without hesitation. "We've been looking for you." She looked from him to the line of black SUVs parked along the curb. "I'm afraid I don't know any of you." "You don't know us," he replied. "But someone inside that aircraft knows you very well." Richard remained near the courthouse entrance. He couldn't hear every word, but he could see Linda's expression. She looked genuinely confused. Whatever was happening, it clearly wasn't something she had arranged. The crowd had grown noticeably quieter. People who had been leaving the courthouse only moments earlier slowed their pace. Nobody wanted to interrupt. Everyone wanted to know what was unfolding. Linda spoke again. "May I ask who's waiting for me?" The man smiled. "I think he'd rather tell you himself." He stepped aside and gestured politely toward the lead SUV. "If you're willing, we'll take you to the executive airport." Linda looked down at the small box in her hands, then back at the stranger. "I just walked out of divorce court." "I know." His answer surprised her. "We saw the news this morning." Her eyebrows lifted. "The news?" He nodded. "A local station covered several courthouse stories today. Our founder happened to see you leaving. He recognized you immediately." Linda searched her memory. "I'm sorry. I can't imagine who that would be." "You will." There was warmth in his voice. "The moment you see him." Richard's curiosity got the better of him. Without drawing attention to himself, he slowly walked toward the edge of the courthouse steps. He stayed far enough away that he couldn't be accused of listening in, yet close enough to see the vehicles pull away if Linda accepted the invitation. He had never seen her look so uncertain. Linda finally asked the question everyone else was silently wondering. "Why would someone send a private jet for me?" The man answered with complete sincerity. "Because some debts can't be repaid with a phone call." For the first time since leaving the courtroom, Linda's eyes filled again, not with sadness, with confusion. She shook her head. "I don't understand." "You will." After a brief pause, she looked toward the courthouse behind her. Her marriage had officially ended less than an hour earlier. Nothing about this day had unfolded the way she imagined. She took one slow breath. "All right, I'll come." The man nodded gratefully. "Thank you." One of the SUV doors opened. Linda climbed inside, still holding the small cardboard box. As the vehicle pulled away from the courthouse, Richard watched it disappear into Houston traffic. He remained standing on the sidewalk long after the last SUV turned the corner. Only one thought occupied his mind. Who could possibly value Linda enough to send an aircraft for her? Nearly 40 minutes later, the convoy entered the executive side of a Houston airport. Unlike the crowded commercial terminals, this part of the airport moved with quiet efficiency. Business aircraft rested on the tarmac. Ground crews completed routine inspections. Pilots walked between hangars carrying flight bags. Linda stepped out of the SUV and immediately noticed the aircraft waiting ahead. Its polished exterior reflected the afternoon sun. The cabin door stood open. A flight attendant waited near the entrance. The engines remained silent, as though the airplane itself understood that this moment wasn't about speed. It was about gratitude. Linda looked at the aircraft in disbelief. She stopped herself. "I've never even been near a private jet." The man beside her smiled. "Today seems like the right day to change that." She laughed softly, despite everything she had experienced that morning. "I still don't understand why I'm here." "You will." They walked toward the aircraft. As Linda reached the bottom of the stairs, a man in his early 30s appeared in the doorway. He wasn't wearing an expensive designer suit. Pinned neatly to his jacket was an Air Force service pin. The moment he saw Linda, his expression changed. His composure gave way to unmistakable emotion. He descended the stairs without rushing. When he reached the bottom, he stopped a respectful distance away. For several seconds, neither spoke. Linda studied his face. She knew she had seen him before. She simply couldn't place where. The young man smiled. "You haven't changed." Linda searched her memory. "I'm so sorry. I know you. He laughed warmly. "You used to tell all of us not to apologize for taking time to remember." She looked at him again. Then something in his smile brought the past rushing back. The aviation classroom, Saturday mornings, scholarship workshops, practice interviews. young faces filled with equal parts hope and uncertainty. Her eyes widened. "Oh, you were one of my students." He nodded. "I was." Linda smiled with genuine delight. "I remember now. You always sat near the back. You hardly spoke during the first few weeks." He laughed. "That's because I was convinced I didn't belong there. You noticed." "I noticed everything," Linda answered instinctively. "That was part of my job." His eyes glistened. "No, it was part of your heart." She looked at him, speechless. "I almost quit after my second month. You probably don't even remember." "I do. You stayed after everyone else went home. You asked me one question." Linda searched her memory. "What did I ask?" He smiled. "Are you giving up because you're incapable or because you're afraid?" Linda slowly remembered. "You didn't answer right away." "I couldn't, because nobody had ever asked me that honestly before." He looked toward the aircraft behind him. "I went home thinking about those words. The next Saturday, I came back, and the Saturday after that, and the one after that." Linda listened quietly. "You helped me rewrite scholarship essays until they finally sounded like me instead of what I thought colleges wanted to hear. You made me practice interviews until I stopped apologizing every time I answered a question. You taught me that leadership wasn't about being the loudest person in the room. It was about becoming someone other people could trust." He smiled through emotion. "When I doubted myself, you never did." Linda lowered her eyes. "I only reminded you what was already there." He shook his head gently. "No, you helped me see it. I earned a scholarship. I entered aviation. I served my country." He touched the Air Force service pin. "Every time I put this uniform on, I remembered the Saturdays when you refused to let me believe my neighborhood decided my future." Linda covered her mouth with one hand. Tears slipped down her cheeks. She wasn't crying because someone had praised her. She was overwhelmed because she had never realized how deeply one life had been changed. The young man smiled. "You thought you were spending Saturdays teaching aviation. You were really teaching people to believe they belonged in places they had never imagined." For the first time that day, Linda felt something stronger than grief. Hope, quiet, steady, and completely unexpected. For a few moments, Linda couldn't speak. She stood at the bottom of the aircraft stairs, holding the same cardboard box she had carried out of the courthouse, while the young man she had once mentored stood before her with tears in his eyes. The airport around them continued its quiet routine. Ground crews moved in the distance. A business aircraft taxied toward another hangar. Somewhere beyond the runway, another plane lifted into the Texas sky. Yet for Linda, everything seemed to pause. She looked at the Air Force service pin on his jacket before meeting his eyes again. "I honestly never imagined," she said softly. Her voice caught. "I never imagined you remembered all of that." He smiled. "Miss Linda, I remember far more than you think." He motioned toward the aircraft. "Would you come inside?" Linda nodded. "I'd like that." A member of the flight crew welcomed her aboard before quietly stepping away to give them privacy. The cabin reflected comfort without excess. It wasn't decorated to impress. It was designed for people who valued purpose over display. Linda carefully placed the cardboard box on a nearby seat before taking in her surroundings. She laughed quietly to herself. "This morning, I thought my biggest decision would be where I was going to start over." She looked around the cabin. "I certainly didn't expect this." The young man smiled. "Neither did I." She looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" "I never imagined the day I finally thanked you would happen like this." He sat across from her. "When I saw the local news this morning," he paused, "I almost couldn't believe it." Linda listened without interrupting. The reporter was covering several courthouse cases. For only a few seconds, the camera showed you walking outside carrying that little box. He glanced toward it. I recognized you immediately. Linda lowered her eyes. I was hoping nobody I knew would see that. He gently shook his head. I'm grateful I did. She looked back up. I called everyone on our leadership team. I told them we were leaving for Houston. You came all this way. Today? Immediately. He nodded. There wasn't another choice. Linda looked genuinely puzzled. You could have called me. I could have. But a phone call wasn't enough. You spent years showing up for us. I wanted to show up for you. His words settled quietly between them. Linda leaned back in her seat. I never expected anything in return. I know. That's exactly why we came. He smiled as old memories returned. Do you remember those scholarship workshops? Linda laughed softly. How could I forget? You all wanted perfect essays. And I kept telling you, colleges weren't looking for perfect people. He laughed with her. You made every one of us throw away our first drafts. They sounded like somebody else's life. Linda nodded. They weren't honest. You kept saying, nobody can tell your story better than you can. He smiled. I was frustrated. I thought mine wasn't good enough. Linda remembered. You said everyone else had bigger accomplishments. I did. And you asked me one question. She thought for a second before answering. I asked whether courage counted as an accomplishment. His smile widened. You remembered. I remember people. She smiled warmly. I always have. He looked toward the window before continuing. There was another Saturday. I almost never told anyone about it. Linda listened carefully. I had failed an important exam. I was embarrassed. I decided not to come. You called. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. I did. You didn't ask why I was absent. You didn't lecture me. You simply said, we'll save your seat. He paused, emotion filling his voice. Nobody had ever said something like that to me before. Linda smiled through tears. I wasn't saving a chair. I was saving hope. He nodded. And that's exactly what you did. The cabin became quiet again. Not uncomfortable. Reflective. Linda stared out the window at the runway. So many Saturdays. She whispered, almost to herself. I never knew which conversations mattered most. He answered immediately. That's because they all mattered. He leaned forward. You didn't just teach aviation. You taught consistency. You taught discipline. You taught confidence. When someone struggled, you stayed. When someone succeeded, you celebrated them without taking credit. When someone doubted themselves, he smiled. You believed enough for both of you. Linda wiped another tear from her cheek. I always hoped those lessons stayed with you. They became the foundation of my life. He looked toward the Air Force pin again. Military training challenged me. Flight school challenged me. Leadership challenged me. But whenever I wanted to quit, I remembered the Saturdays you refused to let us settle for less than we were capable of becoming. Linda quietly shook her head. I honestly thought I was simply volunteering. He smiled. No, you were building futures. She lowered her eyes again. No one had ever described it that way, because they only saw the Saturdays. They never saw the years. He paused before continuing. After my military service ended, several of us founded an aerospace organization focused on training the next generation. Linda looked up with genuine interest. You stayed in aviation. I couldn't imagine doing anything else. We partner with schools. We support military families. We help students find pathways into aviation careers. Linda's smile slowly returned. That sounds wonderful. It is. But every time we reached another milestone, I kept thinking about you. She looked surprised. Me? I kept asking myself one question. When would I finally have an opportunity to thank the woman who made me believe I belonged in this industry? Linda looked down at her hands resting in her lap. I never expected thanks. I know. You expected nothing. That's why today matters. He took a slow breath. When I watched you leaving that courthouse alone, he looked at the cardboard box. I realized something. The world was looking at that box. We were looking at the life behind it. He continued gently. Some people saw a woman leaving with almost nothing. We saw someone who had already given thousands of people more than they could ever repay. Linda's eyes filled once more. Not from sadness, from the overwhelming realization that the quiet Saturdays Richard had struggled to understand had never disappeared into the past. They had continued growing inside lives she might never fully know. The young man smiled. I want you to understand something before we talk about why you're really here. Linda waited. This isn't charity. It isn't sympathy. It isn't rescue. He spoke with calm certainty. Today is about honor. You invested in people when nobody was watching. You changed lives without asking for recognition. And everyone involved in our organization believes that kind of leadership deserves something far greater than applause. Linda sat in thoughtful silence. She had spent years encouraging other people to believe they belonged. She had never imagined that one day those very people would return carrying proof that every hour, every conversation, every scholarship application, every interview practice session, and every Saturday morning had mattered far more than she had ever dared to hope. For the first time since leaving the courthouse, the weight she had carried all morning began to lift. Not because her pain had disappeared, but because she finally understood something that grief had almost hidden from her. Nothing she had poured into other people had ever been lost. It had simply been growing beyond her sight. Linda sat quietly for several moments. She looked out the aircraft window toward the runway, where ground crews continued their work, completely unaware that her life had changed again within the span of a single afternoon. The young man waited patiently. He had learned years earlier that Linda never rushed important conversations. She believed people deserved time to absorb moments that carried lasting meaning. Finally, she turned back toward him. I still don't understand why you brought me here. He smiled gently. Everything we've talked about so far explains why we came. He paused. What I'm about to tell you explains what comes next. Linda folded her hands in her lap and listened. You taught us that every dream deserves a runway. You gave hundreds of young people their first opportunity to believe they belonged in aviation. You helped students prepare scholarship applications. You coached interviews. You connected families with opportunities they never knew existed. You stayed late. You answered phone calls. You celebrated every small victory. He smiled. You built something remarkable. Linda shook her head modestly. I only helped where I could. You did far more than that. He reached into a leather portfolio resting beside his seat. For a brief moment, Linda assumed he was about to show her photographs from the aviation program or updates about former students. Instead, he removed a neatly prepared folder. He placed it carefully on the table between them. I'd like you to read this. Linda opened the folder slowly. The first page carried the logo of the nationwide aviation education organization he had helped establish after completing his military service. She turned the page. Her eyes paused, then widened. She looked up at him in disbelief. She looked back at the document. This can't be. He smiled. It can. She read the title once more. Linda looked back at him. This is a job offer. It is. She stared at the pages without speaking. Her eyes moved slowly across the description. The role would oversee aviation education programs across the country. It would strengthen partnerships with schools, expand scholarship opportunities, support military families transitioning into civilian aviation careers, help local communities create aviation career pathways for young people who had never imagined themselves in that world, coordinate leadership training for volunteer mentors, build relationships with educators aviation organizations, and community leaders. Everything she read sounded strangely familiar, not because she had done those exact tasks before, because every page reflected the same purpose that had quietly guided her Saturdays for years. She looked at him again. "You want me to lead this?" "We do. I'm not sure I'm qualified." He laughed softly. Linda looked surprised. "What? I've heard you say those exact words before." She frowned thoughtfully. "When?" "The first time someone asked you to coordinate the Saturday program. You said you weren't qualified." He smiled warmly. "You still accepted." Linda couldn't help laughing. "I remember. You told me something." She tilted her head. "What was it?" He answered without hesitation. "You'll learn by serving. Just don't stop serving." She covered her face for a second and laughed through tears. "I really said that?" "You did, and we never forgot it." He leaned forward. "Our leadership team didn't choose you because you have the most impressive resume. We chose you because we know exactly what happens when you believe in people." He pointed gently toward the folder. "You've already been doing this work, only on a smaller stage. We're simply asking you to bring that same heart to communities across America." Linda looked down again. The salary listed in the offer was generous, far beyond anything she had expected. She barely noticed it. Her attention kept returning to another section. Mission. Expand access. Develop future leaders. Increase educational opportunities. Strengthen communities. Create scholarships. Mentor the next generation. She whispered almost to herself. "This feels like everything I've been praying for." He smiled. "That's what we hoped." Linda sat quietly. Her mind returned to every Saturday she had questioned whether the work mattered. Every evening she had driven home wondering whether a single conversation had changed anything. Every time someone had suggested she was sacrificing too much for people who could never repay her. Now those years stood before her in a completely different light. She looked up. "You're not offering me a new purpose." He shook his head. "No. We're offering you a bigger runway." The words settled deeply within her. She smiled. "I like that." He laughed. "I was hoping you would." Linda closed the folder gently. "I need to ask one question. Anything. If I accept, will I still spend time with students?" His smile grew even wider. "That was the first question our board hoped you'd ask." She laughed. "I couldn't help it. You won't be leaving students behind. You'll be helping thousands more. We're expanding into schools across the country. We're creating new scholarship programs. We're partnering with educators. We're strengthening aviation pathways for military families. We're building opportunities in communities that have been overlooked for far too long. You'll still meet students. You'll still mentor. You'll still encourage. The difference is that your work won't stop at one city." Linda slowly nodded. She could almost picture it. Classrooms filled with curious young people. Parents discovering possibilities they had never considered. Communities opening doors that had remained closed for generations. The vision filled her with quiet excitement. Then she thought about the morning she had just lived. The courthouse. The signatures. The cardboard box. She smiled sadly. "I woke up believing I was losing my future." The young man answered gently. "You were making room for it." A tear slipped down Linda's cheek. This time she didn't wipe it away immediately. She let herself feel the weight of everything that had happened. The sorrow, the gratitude, the surprise, the hope. All of it belonged to this moment. Finally, she looked directly at him. "When would you want me to begin?" He smiled before answering. "We were hoping you'd say yes first." Linda laughed for the first time that day without sadness hiding behind it. "Then my answer is yes." She placed one hand gently on the folder. "Not because of the salary." She looked around the aircraft. "Not because of the private jet." She met his eyes again. "I'm saying yes because every page in this folder reminds me why I started volunteering in the first place. I've always believed that if one young person discovers a future they never thought was possible, the time was worth it." She smiled with calm confidence. "If this allows me to help thousands more, then I already know exactly where I belong." The young man stood. "So do we." He extended his hand. Linda looked at it for only a second, before warmly shaking it. The handshake wasn't simply the acceptance of a new position. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one built upon years of unseen faithfulness, one rooted in ordinary Saturdays that had quietly transformed countless lives. Outside, the aircraft crew completed the final preparations for departure. Inside, Linda no longer felt like the woman who had walked out of the courthouse carrying only a cardboard box. She still carried that box, but now she also carried something far greater, a renewed sense of purpose, the confidence that every unseen act of service had mattered, and the opportunity to help thousands of young people discover that their dreams deserved a chance to take flight. As the aircraft door closed and preparations for departure began, Linda looked through the window at the Texas sky. For the first time all day, she wasn't looking back. She was looking ahead. Several months passed. Spring slowly gave way to the warmth of another Texas summer, and the organization Linda had agreed to lead began growing faster than anyone had predicted. What had once been a collection of regional aviation education programs gradually became a coordinated national initiative connecting schools, educators, aviation professionals, military families, and community organizations that shared one simple goal: help young people discover possibilities they had never believed were available to them. Linda approached the position exactly as she had approached every Saturday she had ever volunteered. She learned people's names. She listened before making decisions. She visited classrooms instead of remaining behind an office desk. She met with teachers, parents, community leaders, and volunteers, not because she believed titles deserved attention, but because she believed every successful program depended on people feeling valued. Whenever she visited a new city, she insisted on spending time with students before attending meetings. More than once, members of the leadership team gently reminded her that executives usually began with presentations and strategic planning sessions. Linda would smile. "We'll have better plans after we hear from the people we're serving." That approach slowly became part of the organization's culture. Instead of measuring success only through reports and statistics, teams began collecting stories from students and families. A high school student who became the first person in the family to receive an aviation scholarship. A military spouse who discovered a new career pathway after years of uncertainty. A teacher who transformed an unused classroom into an aviation learning space after receiving support from the initiative. Those stories spread through the organization with the same enthusiasm people often reserved for financial milestones. Linda reminded everyone during meetings, "Numbers matter. They help us measure progress. But every number represents a person. Never forget the person." Her words became something many employees quietly repeated to one another whenever difficult decisions had to be made. Back in Houston, people who had known Linda for years watched her new responsibilities with quiet pride. The nonprofit where she had volunteered every Saturday continued welcoming new students, but the programs now had additional resources, expanded scholarship opportunities, and stronger partnerships than ever before. Former volunteers often smiled when they watched new students arrive. Many of them had no idea that the woman whose ideas had helped shape the national initiative had once spent countless Saturdays arranging chairs, carrying boxes, answering nervous questions, and staying long after everyone else had gone home. To Linda, none of that work had ever felt small. She still visited Houston whenever her schedule allowed. She refused to become someone who only appeared for ceremonies or photographs. Instead, she quietly sat beside students practicing interviews, encouraged parents who wondered whether college was financially possible, and congratulated volunteers whose dedication kept local programs thriving. One Saturday morning, a parent approached her after a workshop. "I've Wanted to thank you. Linda smiled. For what? My son used to believe aviation was something other people did. The parent's eyes filled with emotion. Now he's talking about engineering every single day. Linda laughed softly. I hope he's ready to study. Oh, he is. The parent smiled. You didn't just change his plans. You changed how he sees himself. Linda accepted the compliment with humility. I'm grateful he believed in himself enough to take the first step. The parent gently shook a head. He took that step because someone believed in him first. Those words stayed with Linda long after the workshop ended. Meanwhile, local newspapers and television stations began highlighting the remarkable growth of the initiative. Reporters interviewed educators whose schools had joined the program. Parents shared stories about opportunities their children had never imagined. Community organizations praised the scholarships now reaching neighborhoods that had previously lacked access to aviation education. Although Linda never sought public attention, her name appeared frequently whenever people discussed the initiative's success. She accepted interviews only when they helped promote the students, rather than herself. Whenever a reporter congratulated her on the organization's achievements, she redirected the conversation. This work belongs to teachers. It belongs to volunteers. It belongs to families who never stopped encouraging their children. It belongs to every student willing to keep learning. People appreciated that sincerity. It never sounded rehearsed. It sounded like Linda. Across Houston, Richard's business also continued moving forward. The investor partnership had opened important opportunities. His calendar remained full of meetings, conferences, and industry events. By every traditional measure, he had achieved much of what he had once hoped to build. Yet something had quietly changed. Success no longer felt exactly the way he had imagined. He often found himself remembering conversations with Linda that he hadn't thought about in months, particularly one sentence. They are my future. At the time, he had believed she was speaking emotionally. Now he wasn't so sure. One afternoon, Richard attended a major aerospace conference in Houston. Executives, educators, manufacturers, nonprofit leaders, and aviation professionals filled the convention center. He expected conversations about technology, workforce development, and investment. Those conversations happened. But another topic seemed to appear everywhere he went. Linda. He heard her name while waiting for coffee. He heard it again during a panel discussion. He heard educators praising scholarship programs connected to the initiative she now led. Parents discussed opportunities their children had received. Industry leaders spoke about the growing need to invest in future talent rather than waiting for shortages to appear. Richard stood quietly after one presentation, as several attendees gathered nearby. One remarked, "The executive director has completely changed how communities think about aviation education." Another nodded. "The partnerships have been remarkable." A third added, "What impresses me most isn't the expansion. It's the trust. Schools trust the organization. Families trust it. Students trust it. You can't manufacture that." Richard remained still. He wasn't part of the conversation. He simply listened. For the first time, he realized something that had never truly occurred to him during his marriage. The relationships he had spent years trying to build through networking had often depended on introductions, influence, and opportunity. The respect Linda now received had grown differently. One student at a time, one family at a time, one Saturday at a time. Nobody had handed it to her. She had earned it through years of consistency that almost nobody noticed while it was happening. Richard slowly looked around the conference hall. Booths displayed aircraft technology. Educational exhibits welcomed students. Community organizations recruited volunteers. Everywhere he turned, people spoke about preparing the next generation. Without warning, one memory returned with remarkable clarity. Linda, standing in their kitchen years earlier. "They don't need to help our future. They are my future." Standing there among hundreds of people discussing aviation's future, Richard finally understood what she had been trying to tell him all along. She had never been giving away her Saturdays. She had been investing them. and the return on that investment could now be seen in lives transformed across communities he had never even visited. Richard remained in the conference hall long after the presentation had ended. People continued moving from one exhibit to another, exchanging business cards and discussing new partnerships. Normally, this was the kind of environment where he felt completely at home. Today, he barely noticed any of it. His thoughts stayed with Linda, not the executive director people were praising, not the woman whose name now appeared in industry publications. The Linda who had stood in their kitchen years earlier, calmly packing a bag for another Saturday at the aviation program. The Linda who had smiled at students after spending an entire week working. The Linda who had tried, over and over again, to explain that investing in people wasn't taking time away from their future. It was building one. For the first time since their divorce, Richard wasn't asking himself whether he had been wrong about networking. He still believed relationships mattered. What finally changed was his understanding of which relationships mattered most. He had spent years pursuing influential people because he believed influence created opportunity. Linda had spent those same years creating opportunities so that ordinary people could become influential. The difference suddenly seemed impossible to ignore. That evening, he drove home without turning on the radio. Houston's familiar streets passed quietly beyond the windshield. He remembered the nights they had taken long drives together, the conversations, the laughter, the comfortable silence that had once existed between them. He also remembered the conversations that had come later, the ones where both of them spoke sincerely, but somehow walked away feeling unheard. He reached home, sat in the driveway for several minutes, and admitted something to himself that he had never fully accepted before. He had respected Linda as his wife. He had loved her deeply. But somewhere along the way, he had stopped respecting the calling that shaped her life. He had never intended to. He had never tried to diminish her. Yet intentions didn't erase consequences. The realization stayed with him throughout the week. Several times he picked up his phone, thinking about calling her. Each time he put it back down, not because he was afraid she wouldn't answer, because he wanted to be certain he understood why he was calling. He wasn't looking for another chance at marriage. He wasn't hoping to reopen a chapter they had both painfully closed. He simply wanted to acknowledge a truth he should have recognized years earlier. A few days later, he finally made the call. When Linda answered, her voice carried the same warmth he remembered. "Hello? Hi, Linda." She immediately recognized him. "Richard, how are you?" She smiled softly. "I'm doing well. I've been traveling quite a bit." "I heard." He paused. "I was wondering if you'd have time to meet." There was a brief silence. Not uncomfortable. Thoughtful. "What did you have in mind?" "Just coffee. I'd like to talk." She considered his request. "All right. When?" They agreed on an afternoon later that week. Neither tried to make the meeting complicated. Neither treated it like the beginning of something new. It was simply two people choosing to finish an unfinished conversation with honesty. The coffee shop they selected was quiet enough for conversation without attracting attention. Richard arrived early. When Linda walked through the door, he stood instinctively. For a moment, they simply smiled. Time had changed many things, but mutual courtesy had never disappeared. "It's good to see you," Richard said. "You too." They ordered coffee and found a table near the window. For a few minutes, they talked naturally about work, travel, and the growth of the aviation initiative. Richard congratulated her. "You've accomplished something remarkable." Linda smiled modestly. "A lot of people worked very hard." "I know, but they all seem to point back to you." She laughed softly. "I still point back to them." He smiled. "That hasn't changed." "No, it hasn't." The conversation slowed. Richard wrapped both hands around his coffee cup before finally speaking. "I didn't ask you here to talk about the initiative." "I thought so." He looked directly at her. "I asked you here because I owe you an apology." Linda listened quietly. He continued without rushing. "I've replayed a lot of our conversations over the past few months. I kept thinking about everything I believed I was trying to accomplish. I wanted to build a secure future for us. I still don't think that goal was wrong. Linda nodded. I never thought it was. He took a slow breath. What was wrong? Was believing your dream mattered less than mine. Linda remained silent. Richard continued. I never called your work unimportant, but I reduced it without realizing I was doing it. He looked down briefly. I introduced you by saying, my wife volunteers, when I should have been saying, my wife changes lives. Emotion tightened his voice. I didn't see the difference then. I do now. Linda's eyes glistened, not because she had waited years to hear those words, because she knew how difficult they had been for him to say. Richard continued, I thought I was asking you to make a practical decision. What I was really asking was for you to walk away from a part of yourself. I didn't understand that. I should have. He looked at her with complete sincerity. I'm sorry. I'm not asking you to forgive me because I expect anything in return. I'm not asking to go back. I know we both accepted where life led us. I simply couldn't move forward without telling you that you deserved better from me. For several moments, Linda said nothing. She wanted to choose her words carefully. Finally, she smiled. Thank you. Richard looked surprised. That's all? She laughed gently. What more needs to be said? He shook his head. I don't know. Linda leaned back slightly. Richard, I accepted your apology before you finished speaking. He looked at her in disbelief. You did? She nodded. I forgave you a long time ago. He stared at her. Why? Because carrying resentment would have asked me to become someone I never wanted to be. She paused. You weren't trying to hurt me. You were trying to protect what you believed was important. He nodded slowly. And you were trying to protect what you believed was important. She smiled. Exactly. For the first time since they had sat down, both of them laughed quietly. Not because anything was amusing, because the truth finally felt lighter than the misunderstanding they had carried for so long. Linda looked thoughtfully out the window before speaking again. You know something? What? We spent years trying to convince each other that our own way of serving people was the better one. Richard smiled. We did. When really? She looked back at him. The world needs people who build businesses honestly. And it needs people who build hope. He nodded. It was never supposed to be a competition. No, it wasn't. Richard smiled with genuine peace. I finally understand what you meant all those Saturdays. Linda laughed softly. It only took you a little while. He laughed too. A little longer than it should have. As they finished their coffee, neither felt the need to revisit old arguments. The past no longer needed defending. It only needed understanding. When they stood to leave, Richard extended his hand. Linda looked at it for a moment, before warmly shaking it. It wasn't the handshake of strangers, nor was it the beginning of another romance. It was something quieter. Two people acknowledging that although their marriage had ended, the respect they once lost had finally found its way home. As they walked toward the parking lot, both carried something they had been missing for a long time. Not each other. Peace. Several weeks after Richard and Linda shared coffee and finally found the words they had both needed to say, the National Aviation Education Initiative celebrated another milestone. Students from communities across Texas had completed an intensive aviation training program. For many of them, graduation represented far more than the end of a course. It marked the beginning of a future they had once believed belonged to someone else. The training airfield buzzed with excitement from the moment families began arriving. Parents carried cameras. Grandparents searched for the best seats. Volunteers greeted everyone with the same welcoming spirit that had shaped the program from the beginning. Linda arrived early, as she always did. Long before the ceremony started, she walked through the hangar greeting instructors, thanking volunteers, and checking on students whose nervous smiles reminded her of so many Saturdays years before. She paused beside one young student, adjusting a flight headset. Nervous? A little, she smiled. Good. The student looked surprised. Really? It means you understand today matters. She gently adjusted the headset. But don't let nervousness convince you that you don't belong. The student smiled. I won't. I know. Nearby, families filled the viewing area as a training aircraft completed another smooth landing. The sound of applause spread across the airfield, not because anyone had become a professional pilot overnight, because every safe landing represented another dream, moving one step closer to becoming reality. Linda looked across the crowd. She saw parents wiping away tears. She saw volunteers hugging former students. She saw educators proudly pointing toward young people they had encouraged through difficult moments. She smiled quietly. This was why she had never regretted a single Saturday. The ceremony began with a brief welcome. Instead of focusing on titles or achievements, the speakers highlighted the determination of the students, the commitment of families, and the generosity of communities that had worked together to create opportunities. When Linda was invited to speak, she walked to the front with the same calm confidence that had carried her through years of mentoring. She looked across the audience. I've been asked many times what success looks like. She paused. People often expect me to describe awards, promotions, or impressive accomplishments. She smiled. But success has never looked like that to me. She gestured gently toward the graduating students. Success looks like someone discovering courage they didn't know they had. It looks like a family celebrating possibilities that once felt impossible. It looks like teachers, volunteers, parents, and neighbors believing in young people long before those young people believe in themselves. The audience listened in complete silence. Linda continued. Every person standing here today reached this moment because somebody invested time, encouragement, patience, and hope. No one succeeds alone, and none of us should ever underestimate the difference one encouraging voice can make. Warm applause filled the air. As the ceremony continued, students were invited to board a training aircraft in small groups for introductory flights. Excitement spread quickly. Some laughed nervously. Others looked toward the runway with wide eyes. One little girl, who had spent most of the morning asking thoughtful questions, remained standing beside the boarding area. She watched the older students climb the stairs into the aircraft. Linda noticed her hesitation and walked over. What are you thinking about? The little girl looked up. They all look so brave. Linda smiled. They're excited. They're nervous, too. The little girl lowered her voice. Do you think someone like me could really do this? Linda didn't answer immediately. She knelt until they were looking at one another at eye level. She remembered another time, another generation, another student who had quietly believed aviation belonged to other people. She smiled with complete confidence. Someone like you already is. The little girl's face brightened. Really? Linda nodded. Dreams don't ask where you started. They ask whether you're willing to keep learning. The little girl smiled so broadly that her parents couldn't stop smiling too. She waved excitedly as she joined the next group heading toward the aircraft. Linda remained where she was, watching each student climb aboard. The engine started. The propeller began turning. The aircraft slowly taxied toward the runway. Families stood together along the viewing area. Cameras raised, hearts full of hope. Linda folded her hands quietly. Years ago, she had watched airplanes beside her father, while wondering how those machines inspired people to dream. Now she understood. The airplanes had never been the greatest lesson. The people willing to encourage others before they could see their own potential. That was the lesson. The training aircraft accelerated smoothly. Its wheels lifted from the runway. The crowd applauded as it climbed into the bright Texas sky. Linda followed it with her eyes until it became a small silhouette against the horizon. She thought about her mother, whose compassion had taught her that caring for people always mattered. She thought about her father, who had shown her that the work people rarely notice often keeps everyone moving safely forward. She thought about the Saturdays that Richard had struggled to understand. She thought about the young man who had returned with a private jet, not to rescue her, but to thank her. She thought about Richard himself. His apology had not changed the past. It had honored the truth, and sometimes Truth was the greatest gift one person could offer another. She smiled. Not because life had unfolded exactly as she once imagined. It hadn't. But because she had finally learned that losing one chapter didn't prevent another from becoming extraordinary. The narrator's voice returned one final time. The greatest investments are rarely measured in dollars. They are measured in lives changed. In doors opened for someone who believed they would always remain closed. In quiet encouragement offered without expecting recognition. In ordinary Saturdays that become extraordinary years. In hope passed from one generation to the next. Because the most valuable legacy we leave behind isn't what we keep. It's what we help someone else become. If Linda's journey reminded you of someone who invested in your life when you needed it most, share their story in the comments. Your words may encourage someone else to keep believing in a dream that feels out of reach today. And if you enjoy uplifting stories about resilience, purpose, forgiveness, and the power of ordinary people changing lives, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Mr. George Stories, and join us for another unforgettable journey. Until next time, thank you for spending your time with us. Take care of yourself, and whenever you have the chance, be the person who believes in someone before the rest of the world does.